Romulan, who's having IT issues. Welcome to everyone. I will be taking command of SUAS in February, and so have a few words to say at the end. Sirs, ladies, gentlemen, members of SUAS, members of UGSAS, UAS alumni, friends and family, and most importantly, to Flt Lt Ernie Holmes, DFC himself, welcome. Tonight has been a long night in the planning, some would say 100 years or so, and I hope that it's going to be a night to remember. Without much further ado, I'd like to hand over to Air Officer Scotland, who's going to say a few words. Sir.
If I can just butt in, so just slightly, we're going to get Ernie with all the people on board. Ernie, can you just say hello to the 226 people?
Dad.
Yeah, I think he's speaking.
Dad, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now, David.
All right. Everyone is here now. Would you like to say hello to everyone?
Hello to everyone. This is Ernie speaking. Give me the good news.
Well, the good news
there's lots of good news to come soon, sir. Lots of good news to come soon.
Everyone can see you and everyone can hear you. So there's, how many did we say?
I've got 226, it says at the moment. We know one or two are doubled up in various groups around the world. So that's fantastic.
So there's probably about 300 people listening. And would you like to say hello and thank you to them? I'll leave that to you. Over. Dad.
Hello.
Kieran.
Hello to all. Is there any call in the world?
That is, well, fantastic. Well, Ernie, sit back, relax, and ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, gives me a great pleasure, please, if I can introduce Air Vice Marshal Ross Patterson, who is Air Officer Scotland, to say a few words.
Thanks, Paul. Lord Lieutenants, ladies and gentlemen, and Ernie in particular, it's my great pleasure to add a very warm welcome to everybody here, especially you, Ernie, family and friends from across the world as you join with us for what I know is going to be a very special evening. I was always told that you can learn a lot from someone about their tie or the cut of their suit, and I guess the option for us now is to see what's behind us all in terms of our backdrops on these Zooms and Teams. And Ernie, others, you may be able to just see the outline there, but behind me on my wall is a picture of 156 Squadron, who were pathfinders at Whitton. And a few years ago, as station commander at Whitton, I was privileged to host a few Pathfinder reunions there and to learn a little of their role. And the euphemism, which again, I'd be fascinated to hear this from you, Ernie, some point, about Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett inviting people to join his team, the new team of Pathfinders, and the reality of their extraordinary bravery is, I'm sure, something that we will hear tonight.
Is that the daughter of Don Bennett?
That is, yeah, that's, no, it's not. I'm not the daughter, but I ran Whitton, Ernie, and I had the honor of having the Pathfinders on my patch for a couple of years. So a lot of, again, I'll when things are easier, I'll come and see you, because I've got a great picture here of Bennett, signed by many people I know you will know who were fellow Pathfinders with you. Many have been involved in making tonight happen. And if I can just publicly thank Monty, it's all been email contact up till now. Ernie's family, David, we've had some contact, and many others but if I can, without sparing his blushes, especially thank the University Air Squadron, Paul Cunningham and the team here for everything they have done and their hard work to tell about Ernie's amazing story as a pilot in Bomber Command. Here in Scotland, we have a unique and immensely rich history in aviation. And I'm delighted to say that we will soon be launching an aviation trail, which will have information of former airfields, radar sites, the 4 regional air museums we have, information from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and as well as that, all of our information and activity that we share with Scottish schools, trying to encourage youngsters to look at careers in science and engineering. And the aim in this is to preserve not only the amazing stories of our nation here, but critically to educate the next generation of the bravery and values of those who've served. And Ernie stands as a shining example of all that is good and honourable about those who step forward in times of crisis and in the finest traditions of the Royal Air Force. And I do hope that we'll be able to include this story within that trail for it to be seen by generations to come. This year, the RAF is leading things at the Tattoo in Edinburgh, and the theme is above and beyond. And Ernie, we're going to be delighted to have you and David hopefully with us at one of our 6 nights. I'm afraid you're going to have to slum it in the Royal Box, but someone's got to do it. And I do hope that you'll be able to join us as our guest of honour for what I know will be a special evening. So Ernie, if I can just close by saying on behalf of the Chief of the Air Staff, all of my colleagues in the senior leadership team, and from everyone here in the Royal Air Force in Scotland, we offer you our sincere congratulations on your birthday, and many more of them, many more of them. We just send you our warmest wishes and every blessing as we mark this great occasion. Thank you so much for what you have done for our country and for the Royal Air Force, and we salute you for that. Happy birthday, Ernie.
Thank you. Thank you. You'd like to put it on, Paul?
You're on mute, Paul.
We know that. Thank you very much. Sir, I say again, I repeat, thank you very much for those memorable words to us all this evening, and thank you very much, as Air Force Scotland, for joining us. If I can now move on to another distinguished guest, the Lord Lieutenant for Perth and Kinross, Mr. Stephen Leckie. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Paul, and Air Vice Marshal, thank you for your kind words about Ernie. And to you, Flight Lieutenant, retired Ernest Holmes, or as you're more popularly called and like to be called, Ernie. Thank you for joining us tonight. Lord Lieutenant of Fife, welcome also to this celebration, and to the students, the many students that you have taught and trained over the years, Ernie. You will hear more from them just very shortly. And of course, Ernie, we are joined by your many family and even more friends. It's just lovely to have you all here. So Ernie, as Lord Lieutenant, I'm delighted in Perth and Kinross to represent the Queen and the royal family, who all would send their regards to you. And not only have you tonight one Lord Lieutenant in your presence, but 2. Now that, Ernie, is real influence in Scotland. Well done for that. It is a privilege for us all to be a part and involved in some way in your story and 100th celebration. You have educated so many, and this show over the next half hour or so will testify to just exactly that. It's great that so many of your students have joined us today and this evening, having seen and learnt so much from you firsthand over the years. and of course the strong link that you have forged and kept hold with, and the family from Holland, the Van der Heydens who are with us tonight, and your own family, David, who's been involved in organising all this, his wife Liz, and your daughter Alison, who is also on screen. Not forgetting, of course, your grandchildren and other wider family. This, Ernie, is quite a party for you. I'm so sorry that we cannot be with you in person. Isn't that just a travesty of the COVID world of today? You have been, Ernie, an incredible inspiration to so many. You are clearly very popular and very well respected. Congratulations, Ernie, on being nearly 100 years old. I bet you can't quite believe it. Well done, Ernie. I'm looking forward to meeting you soon. I'm looking forward to hearing what is said about you further tonight. You are a star, Ernie, and you do look amazing. I hope that everyone else in this room will make it to the age of 100 and look as good as you do. Thank you very much, Ernie, and congratulations and happy birthday. Flight Lieutenant Paul Cunningham, back to you. I, for one, am really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Sir, thank you very much indeed. And I can see Ernie's also saying thank you and listening with intent. Ladies and gentlemen, can I introduce our colleague, Lord Lieutenant, then, as you said, a special honour not to have one but two, the Lord Lieutenant for Fife, obviously covering the Lucas station, Mr. Robert Balfour.
Good evening, everybody. This is quite a surprise for me to be asked to say something. Ernie, it is a real privilege for me to be in on this call to say happy birthday to you. I suppose that one of the reasons I'm here is that your son David and I did the same course at university at the same time, and then after he trained as a doctor, he delivered our youngest child some 32 years ago in Ninewells Hospital, and we've always kept up ever since. When I knew you were going to be 100, and I spoke to David and said, was there anything I could do to help? And Ross Patterson, who the Air Officer Scotland, is actually one of my deputies who I know very well. And so it's been a great pleasure that he's been able to speak to you and say all those kind words to you. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the film that we're going to see shows about your life, because it sounds quite remarkable. And one day I look forward to meeting you when we've got out of this COVID nonsense. But anyway, happy birthday for tomorrow, and many congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard.
Sir, thank you very much for those kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, we've almost completed the opening phrases of our evening, and I'd like to start formally the show. Not only a film, but it's live. We have live people. So I'd like to introduce 6 students. They're all for St Andrews University, and I chose them in November thinking foolishly we'd be able to pop into Lucas Station, of course socially distanced, and be able to work together. That has actually never happened. This has been always online, exchanging documents, photos, etc., etc. So it has been awkward, interesting, and challenging at times. But if I can hand over to the lead of the group, is Acting Part Officer Chris Toward, and he's going to lead on, and they'll start over the 6 sections from then. And then sadly, you have me back for sort of closing and bringing it all together. So Chris Toward, over to yourself for your hello.
Thanks, PT. Good evening, everyone. I'm Acting Pilot Officer Chris Toward, and I study International Relations in my 4th year.
And good evening, I'm Officer Cadet Isaac Turner, and I'm a 2nd year student studying economics.
Hi, I'm Officer Cadet Kitty Rannigan, and I'm a 3rd year student studying maths and economics.
Good evening, everyone. My name is William McMullen. I'm a 2nd year student at St Andrews studying Russian and International Relations.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Officer Cadet Tom McGuinness, and I'm a third-year student at St Andrews studying maths.
Good evening, everyone. I'm OCG Brennan Calland. I'm a second-year medical student at the University of St Andrews.
So Chris is just sharing his screen. That has come up live, Chris.
Just loaded. There we go. Good evening, everyone, again, and welcome to our presentation on the life and career of Ernie Holmes, DFC, an inspirational ex-RAF pilot with a distinguished career in World War II and beyond, who is tomorrow celebrating his 100th birthday. Among various other celebrations of Ernie's birthday, which have and will continue to take place this week and in the coming weeks, we at the East of Scotland University's Air Squadron want to give you an insight into the life and career of Ernie, from his upbringing, flying career during and after the Second World War to the present day. I would like to take this chance to extend the welcome on behalf of the presentation team, as well as all the students from EJUAS, to the many distinguished guests and friends and family of Ernie joining us from all over the world. I've been informed right up until about 10 minutes before the presentation started that members of Ernie's family and his close friends are joining from Scotland, England, Ireland, France, Belgium, Germany, Holland, Sweden, Spain, and Canada and Mexico. So thank you sincerely for coming along and for navigating the tricky time differences. And we sincerely hope that you'll find our presentation both enjoyable and also interesting. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, we're going to take you through the following sections of Ernie's fascinating life: upbringing and early RAF career, his time flying Lancasters on 35 Squadron, the mission of ND 762 and escape and evasion in Holland, his time in Stalag Luft 3, the Long March, excuse me, and his release, and finally his post-war life. Ernie Holmes was born 29th of January 1921 in Hebburn on Tyne. After leaving school at 14, Ernie attended night classes, costing only half a crown, and took a job as a messenger boy while working towards becoming a painter and decorator. Ernie had a tough upbringing. Due to the Great Depression, his father, who worked in shipyards along the Tyne, could not always find steady work. Ernie had always wanted to be a pilot, and at an early stage in his life, when he was just 16 and a half, Ernie cycled to the Three Horses Airfield and asked the adjutant to see if he could join the RAF Volunteer Reserves. Due to his age, the Adj sent him home, telling him quite rudely to come back when he was old enough. Nevertheless, a year and a half later, when Ernie had turned 18, he volunteered immediately to join the RAF and was accepted in 1940. After initial training in Padgate and Blackpool, which only took around 2 months, Ernie was posted as an AC2 to Houghton Park near Manchester, during which time he undertook various roles, such as working in the operations room at 48 Squadron. During this time, Ernie came into contact with a number of pilots who were flying Avro Ansons, which only increased his desire to follow in their footsteps and become a pilot himself. It did not take long for Ernie's dream to become a reality when his natural leadership ability caught the attention of a junior pilot officer who, on taking Ernie to one side, learned that he wanted to be a pilot and assisted him through pilot selection and an interview in London. Ernie was accepted and was subsequently posted to Desford near Leicester to do his elementary flying training, otherwise and still known to this day as EFT. Here he learned how to fly Tiger Moths, which you'll hopefully be able to see on the slide at the right. Following around 30 hours of EFT, Ernie was posted to Canada in 1941 to continue his training. After arriving on a former whaling ship, the Sven Foy, which was destroyed by a U-boat later in the war, Ernie made his way to North Battleford in Saskatchewan to fly the Airspeed Oxford twin-engine training aircraft. On completion of his training in Canada, Ernie earned his wings and made his way back to the UK. In early 1942, Ernie then went to Bournemouth to wait on further postings. From there, he was sent to Abingdon and started flying the Armstrong-Whitley bomber, which Ernie describes as the happiest but also the slowest aircraft the British had before the war. At Abingdon, Ernie undertook lots of night flying and bombing training, and following completion, Ernie was posted to a place just outside of York, where he was converted onto the Halifax, a 4-engine bombing aircraft. Shortly after completion of his training, Ernie was posted to 76 Squadron near Hull. For the first 2 trips he undertook, Ernie observed as a passenger in order to learn about the aircraft and how it functioned in operations. On his 3rd operational flight, Ernie commanded his own crew in the Halifax. During this time, Ernie flew both the Mark II and Mark III Halifaxes, which were made up of a total of 7 crew, 1 pilot, 2 gunners, 1 wireless operator, 1 engineer, 1 navigator, and 1 bomb operator. Ernie conducted a number of operations before volunteering to be a Pathfinder's pilot and converting onto the Lancaster. To take you through this next step in Ernie's flying career is Isaac Turner. Isaac, over to you.
Hi there, good evening. So the Pathfinders can trace their roots back to the early days of World War II, when the Butt report was ordered by Lord Cherwell to examine the effectiveness of the RAF's night bombing campaign. Butt's report, published in 1941, revealed that by the time bomber aircraft reached Germany, only 1 in 10 ever flew within 5 miles of the target, and only 1% of bombs dropped were even in the vicinity of the target. It was clear to senior officers that this was unacceptable, and something had to be done to address this. Moreover, around a similar time, the infamous report on dehousing by Lord Cherwell was in the limelight. After extensive debates in all areas of government, the recommendations of Cherwell's report were accepted, and planning for a major offensive starting in the spring of 1942 began, with the ultimate aim of destroying urban areas of German cities to prevent their workforce from functioning. Alongside these published reports, technological advancements in the form of G-hyperbolic navigation systems, which would be further developed down the line, meant that the Pathfinder Force, formed in August 1942, provided a perfect solution to Bomber Command's early problems. They would locate and mark targets with flares, which the main bomber force could aim at, increasing the accuracy of the bombing. The number 8 Pathfinder group initially consisted of 5 squadrons, but ultimately grew to a strength of 19, including 35 Squadron, which Ernie served on. Shown on the slide is the prestigious Pathfinder's badge, which Pathfinders received upon the completion of training. Moreover, Ernie is seen wearing the badge with pride, just under his wings. Next slide, please. So the proportion of Pathfinder aircraft to main force bombers often varied depending on the target, but a ratio of around 1 to 15 was common. The success of bombing raids largely depended on the accurate marking of targets by the Pathfinder Force. 3 types of target marking were primarily used by the Pathfinder Force, which were known by the code names Parramatta, New Haven and Wanganui, which are locations in Australia, New Zealand and the UK, which all had links to Pathfinder staff. Parramatta used H2S radar signals to drop the markers. H2S, seen on the slide, was the first airborne ground scanning radar system which allowed raids outside the range of other navigational aid systems like G, which were limited to around 220 miles. Derivatives of H2S were used in the RAF for decades after World War II, with them essential to Operation Black Book in the Falklands. The second type of target marking was New Haven, where the Pathfinder aircraft could first use illumination flares to target the area before dropping the target markers for the main bomber force. Lastly, Wanganui was used when the target was obscured by cloud, industrial haze or smoke screen. H2S would again be used to release the markers over the unseen target, but these target indicators were on parachutes, which gave the main bomber force an aiming point. This was also known as sky marking. In every mission, further target markers would be dropped throughout the course of the raid to reinforce the marking of the target, which could become impaired after being struck by bombs. Next slide, please. 35 Pathfinder Squadron, on which Ernie was posted, converted from the Halifax to the Lancaster in March 1944, with the last operation with the Halifax aircraft on the night of the 1st of March on Stuttgart, and the first one with the Lancasters on the 15th of March, also on Stuttgart. With the newly equipped Lancasters being put quickly to use, it is evident to see from Ernie's logbook that the raids were tireless, with frequent missions being flown until Ernie's final mission listed in the logbook with the outcome stated rather eerily as missing. Next slide, please. The mission itself took place on the night of the 22nd of May, 1944. The crew, piloted by Ernie. Hang on. We're having a problem with the screen sharing, Chris.
Yeah, someone else has started sharing, so I've lost it.
All right. Well, I'll hold on at the start of that slide for you to get it back up, and then I'll carry on from there if you want.
Yeah, Olive Ponsford, you need to stop sharing. I'll try again now.
All right. Okay.
Olive, can you stop showing? Yes, thank you. There we go.
Is that working again? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start again there. The mission itself took place on the night of the 22nd of May, 1944. The crew, piloted by Ernie, was made up of 8 members. The crew was not inexperienced. Ernie, the pilot, known as Shirley by his crew, short for Sherlock and surely a compliment to his pathfinding talents. The navigator, Stewart, the wireless operator, Frank Tudor, the 2 bomb aimers, Derek Coleman and Mac Maskell, and the mid-upper gunner Cox were all experienced and had taken part in several operations. For Frank Tudor and Flight Sergeant Cox, it was their 45th operation to complete their Pathfinder tour. In other words, their last sortie before they were required to be rested. The flight engineer, Cursiter, and the rear gunner, McLaren, were on their first operation. In an account of his experiences, one of the bomb aimers, Derek Coleman, spoke of a feeling of apprehension before this particular operation, which was shared by Mac, the second bomb aimer. Coleman speaks of how he completed an inventory of his personal kit for the first time since he arrived at Gravely, and Maskell, perhaps having a premonition of danger, destroyed most of his personal mail. Next slide, please. Lancaster 762 Echo took off from Gravely at 10:47, exiting mainland Britain over Flamborough before heading for Dortmund. It was one of just 361 Lancasters that carried out the first large raid on Dortmund for this year, along with 14 Mosquitoes, nicknamed the Wooden Wonders due to their wooden frame. On the outward journey, their navigation was accurate and the bombing raid was successful. It was only as they were homeward bound that the aircraft was picked up by a night fighter at 16,000 feet. And I'm going to hand over to Kitty to continue the presentation from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. So I'm going to take you through the section where Ernie was shot down on the run and his subsequent capture. So it's going to be a little bit more of a story than anything else. So as Isaac said, it was at 01:21 that they were shot down by a German flying ace, Hans-Heinz Augenstein, in a Junkers Ju-88, pictured here. Augenstein was himself shot down by a Mosquito fighter bomber 7 months later in December 1944. But before his death, he was credited with 46 aerial victories. To be considered a flying ace, you only need 5. Could I have the next slide, please, Chris? For Ernie, the aircraft became difficult to handle and one of the engines had caught fire, so Ernie ordered the crew to bail out and walk southwest. As the aircraft dived towards the ground, Ernie tried desperately to pull the nose back up, but to no avail. Coleman and Tudor managed to bail out of the aircraft, though neither had easy escapes. Coleman's parachute pack had been lying on its side or end, and so when he was putting his parachute on, he managed only to get the left hook on and had to hold the other hook of the parachute to his chest. He had to reach up and pull his parachute down in order for him to pull the D-ring on the right hook. And when he finally managed to reach the D-ring, he realized in his hurry to leave the aircraft he had not unattached his intercom lead, preventing his main chute from opening. Eventually, when it became freed, it was only open for a couple of swings before he hit the ground. Tudor, who had been transmitting the latest winds, did not hear the bailout command, and it was only because he happened to keep his parachute nearer to his crew position on this occasion that he was able to successfully attach it before he was blown through or fell out a hole in the bottom of the aircraft. Upon landing, he crashed into a tree, broke his leg, was concussed, and, in need of urgent medical help, he surrendered himself to the police post in Middle Beers. Meanwhile, Ernie had been thrown forward out of the cockpit, but was still attached to the aircraft by his loose-fitting Sutton harness. He lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he was hanging over the nose. His legs were trapped with the control column, yet he managed to pull himself back into the aircraft and release his harness just in time to make a successful parachute descent. The Lancaster then exploded in the air, killing the 5 other members, including those 2 members on their first operation. Pictured is the original lost card for Lancaster ND 672, detailing the fates of the crew, whether killed or later taken as prisoners of war. The time that elapsed from the Lancaster being hit and then subsequently exploding was only around 12 to 14 seconds, so you can imagine the urgency the crew had to act with. Next slide, please, Chris. Fragments of the bomber and the bodies of the crew fell to earth between Vessem and Middle Beers. You can see here the graves of Cox, Cursiter, McLaren, Maskell, and Stewart, who were buried in Eindhoven General Cemetery, though Cursiter's body was not found until much later. The inscriptions you can see below were added by the families of the deceased in the 50s. Next slide, please. Bomber Command were informed on the 23rd of May that the aircraft and crew were missing, and the RAF procedure was set in motion. Close relatives of every crew member received a telegram, followed by a letter. The personal possessions of the missing were removed and recorded. Equipment was returned to the stores and personal possessions deposited in the central store of the RAF. The families remained uncertain for a long time about the fates of the crew members. Here you can see the original telegram informing Ernie's family that he was missing, and a letter from the RAF Benevolent Fund offering support. Next slide, please, Chris. So Ernie had landed in a muddy field and hid the parachute in a bush and started walking, looking for the North Star to orientate himself. He walked through fields until he came to a cottage. He knocked on the door of the cottage, but with no answer. So he kept walking and came to an open gate. And one thing that struck him was that one of the pillars of this open gate was a concrete bomb, which he later discovered was because the field he had just been walking through was used as a practice bombing area for the Germans. He came to a wood where he heard dogs barking, and he thought that the dogs must be looking for the crew, so went through a flooded field to put them off the scent. At this point it was getting light, and he needed somewhere to hide, and he came to a stream which in a normal state he would have been able to jump over, but he was exhausted and at a stage where he was starting to hallucinate. He didn't have any physical injuries, though he later discovered he had splinters of perspex in his shoulder. He took off his jacket and coat and put his battle dress on and a trench coat on top, which he had because they could wear whatever they wanted to on operations, just in case you got shot down and wanted some kind of camouflage. And this was why he also never wore flying boots, just normal shoes. So at this point, he was really looking for food and looking for company, wondering where his crew were and if they were still alive. He thought he could hear the noises of a blacksmith and imagined that this blacksmith would have a nice big sandwich in a white handkerchief with red dots that he could steal and eat. Could I have the next slide, please? It was at this point that he waded across this stream and came across a path where a young girl was coming down on her bicycle, on her way to milk the cows with 2 milk churns. Every time she hit a bump, these milk churns would clang together, so this was the noise he had been hearing and imagining to be a blacksmith. She said to him, "Guten Morgen," and Ernie thought she was speaking English to him, so he said, "Oh, you speak English?" And she said, "Nein." So he said to her, "RAF," and she indicated for him to hide in the corn until she returned. The girl, named Netche, was the oldest daughter of Fons van der Heijden, pictured here, who returned to Ernie's hiding place along with Jan, his son, a medical student, Piet, who was avoiding the military call-up by going into hiding, and this is because Dutch students were forced to sign an oath of loyalty to Germany. Another student, Willy, and then a painter whose name he didn't know. And this painter didn't speak English, but he asked Willy if Ernie had a gun or any cigarettes, to which Ernie replied, "No, and I don't smoke." And there was much laughter to this response, and the painter said to the others in Dutch, "Oh, well, what use is he to us then? Let's just kill him." So Ernie took a bit of an instant dislike to him. They took Ernie back to the farm, where they undressed him and helped him to wash in a small tin bath. Ernie described being unable to undo his buttons due to his hands being so numb, and perhaps also the sense of relief knowing he was now in safe hands after such a high adrenaline situation. Netche, the oldest daughter, said in Dutch to the others that he was like a baby in a high chair, which became a common expression the family used to refer to him. "Oh, here comes the baby in a high chair." He was then put up in this room that had a picture on the wall with a brick-built toilet on the other side. From the outside, this extension was about 5 to 6 feet long, and you opened the door to discover a toilet seat on the inside. But on the inside, it wasn't 5 or 6 feet long, and this was because they'd built a wall and pulled it forward, and on the other side of this was an escape hatch, access through a hole behind another picture on the wall. Ernie was instructed that if he heard any noises, he was to go through the hole in that wall into the other half of this blocked-off toilet. After a few days, he was moved to the pigsty and lived in the roof of this pigsty, where his one job was to indicate when one of the pigs was giving birth, which he had to do by hanging a towel over the door. And then Netjer would come and sort them out. And it was during this time that he realized that Fons van der Heyden had links to the SOE, which is the Special Operations Executive, a British organisation that helped local resistance movements. And this was because Fons brought him a small bottle of whiskey and 60 gold flake cigarettes, which he wouldn't have been able to obtain by any other means. Could I have the next slide, please, Chris? After his stay in the pigsty, he was then moved to the orchard on the other side of the road, where the students were hiding. Sometimes strangers would come along and move on after a few days. The painter was with them as well, and they later discovered that he had been in conflict with the Germans, and after not returning for several days, they assumed the Germans had found him and killed him. They never saw him again, and the only thing they had of him was a painting he had done of Fons in order to thank him, which hung in the orchard. Ernie stayed on the farm for 2.5 weeks before a businessman, a family friend, came to the farm and gave him a suit and 10 guilders, saying to him that he must leave the farm and get away from the farm or they would all be killed, and he should never say that he was here. The businessman also left a beagle dog, which he had no use for anymore on the farm, and you can see Ernie photographed with this dog at the Van der Heyden farm in the picture on the slide. Next slide, please. So, conscious that he was risking the family's lives, he moved on to the next place, staying with Piet Leermakers in Biesthuteke, transported by 2 Dutch policemen, Theo Bax and Edward Nakens, on bicycles. Theo Bax was the chief policeman of the area at that time. Next slide, please. It's not totally clear exactly where and with whom Ernie went next, so the next few places are various farms and villages with unknown names, but you can see here his rough overall movements. He moved to a farm where he slept in a hole in the ground that was lined with hay and had a wooden hatch on the top. The old man who took him in here had a son in the Dutch Navy who was in the UK, and he wrote his son's name and number on the lining of Ernie's tie, so Ernie could find him when he was back in England. Ernie always left his address with those who took him in, but he never took theirs. Next slide, please. Not far from Murgersdal was, as Ernie described, some form of Trappist abbey, but what was actually a religious training establishment from the Order of the Assumption. Ernie moved here and was looked after by the gamekeepers and a father from the monastery, Father Lambertus, whose real name was Theo Vermeulen. Next slide, please. Derek Coleman, the air bomber, also on the run, was also helped by Father Lambertus and described in his own memoirs how he looked very much like the actor Peter Lorre, which is in the top right-hand corner. So I've circled Father Lambertus in the red, so decide for yourself what you think. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, what is most interesting about this picture in particular is that we believe the man on the far right is Derek Coleman, Ernie's fellow crew member. In Derek's memoirs, he details how when he was staying on a farm with the help of Father Lambertus, second from the right, he came into contact with 2 Canadian airmen of 405 Squadron, one being Eli Baker, who we know is in the middle in the braces, and another named Jean-Emile Davidson, who is likely the man in the suit, second from the left, or another French-Canadian pilot. And this photo was actually found when researching Eli Baker and Father Lambertus, not Derek himself, but all the links with the Canadian pilots and the matching accounts, as well as the strong likeness with the photo on the right of Derek about a year earlier, lead us to believe that this is Derek Coleman while in hiding on the farm, the tall man at the back being the farm owner, Janus Royakas. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, at this point, Ernie only knew that 4 of his crew members had been killed, and 1 was captured, which left 2 more unaccounted for. He then moved to the house of the leader of the underground movement, Group Andre, a man named Adrian van Weilen, in Sprang, and from here to the Pharaoh family in Scravenmore. Other notable aides who may have helped to shelter and transport not only Ernie and Derek, but many other Allied airmen, include Leonie van Hassel and Bim van der Klei, both members of the Tilburg resistance. It's not totally clear where they come into the story, but we know that they both helped Ernie and Derek in some way, shape or form. And it was then when he was moving to the next place that he reunited with Derek. So from here, there was now 7 members of the crew accounted for, 4 dead, 1 captured, and Derek and Ernie on the run. So there was 1 more that they didn't know about. Derek and Ernie both hoped it was Mac or Harold Marskell who had survived, And he had to survive because he was the one with the family, and he had 2 twin boys, which they had all grown very attached to. Due to a difficult birth, the babies always had to be washed with olive oil for their skin. So whenever the crew went anywhere, they would always buy little bottles of olive oil and give them to Mac to take home. So he was kind of the father of the crew. Together, Derek and Ernie were moved to Essen on the border before moving south into Belgium, where they were introduced to a lady in Antwerp who didn't speak English or French, which was unusual for Belgium. But they were instructed not to speak to her, but simply follow her into Antwerp on the tram. There were some German soldiers on the tram, and according to Ernie, what also looked like Hitler Youth. The French Canadian, Jean-Emile Davidson, had joined Derek and Ernie, so they asked him to speak to her in French, but she declined, saying she didn't understand. They got off the tram and were taken into a coffee shop and told to sit down, where the woman they had been following and another man produced a piece of paper, and they knew from that moment that something wasn't right. The man and the woman, they fitted these 2 pieces of paper together as a sort of con to try and convince them that they were members of the underground, and this was the kind of signal that they used to when they met up. Could I have the next slide, please? She went outside to find the car that was to take them to Brussels, where they could escape through France and Spain. She indicated all was well, and they jumped into the back of this car with 2 men in front. They drove only about 500 yards when suddenly the car took a sharp turn into the entrance of the building with armed German sentries outside, and this was Gestapo headquarters in Antwerp. They had been betrayed, caught on the 17th of June, 26 days after the crash, in what was cruelly known as the KLM line, a false escape line for airmen. So the game was up. They were taken in for interrogation, where they were separated, and being so exhausted, Ernie fell asleep, woken up by a German guard kicking him in the back. He turns around to retaliate, but next thing he knew, the muzzle of the rifle was in his mouth. Ernie speaks of how it was actually the lower ranks who were quite aggressive and nasty, and the higher ranks who were actually a lot nicer. He was taken into a room that resembled an old schoolroom with 1 window, where he could see the courtyard that they had driven into. There was no means of escape from the room. They took him and stripped him down and wanted to know who he was. He had to provide proof of him being in the RAF, as if it was believed he was a spy, he would be shot. The man interrogating him didn't believe his dog tags and threw them away, and he was stripped further, and he saw that Ernie was circumcised, to which he said, if you're a spy, we shoot spies, but we have special treatment for Jews. No, it was never a physical pressure applied to them, always a psychological pressure. He was taken to another room where he was stripped again. This time an intelligence officer came to interrogate him. Quite an amusing description of his stature from Ernie as an unusual shape, fat, small, squat, head and shoulders on a barrel. And he was posing as a Red Cross officer, asking him to fill out this form, which Ernie had noticed said printed in Berlin on it. And this signaled to Ernie that this was not a Red Cross officer and this was simply a ploy. And finally, he was taken to a dungeon, which was a prison in Antwerp staffed by the Wehrmacht, the armed forces of Nazi Germany. Most interestingly, there was a man facing the wall in a new suit, dressed as a Jewish rabbi. And Ernie was thinking, well, where would a Jewish rabbi get such a new suit from in 1944? And he suspected from his rather round shape that it was the same man who posed as this Red Cross officer. And again, this was all part of another ploy. A man with a machine gun was rattling it against the table, saying Juda, Juda, which was German for Jew, trying to get him to admit he was a Jew. And the idea was that he would turn to the rabbi for help if indeed he was a Jew. And Ernie speaks of how you can't let them know that it doesn't work because it might worsen the case for someone else. So Ernie had spotted the giveaways of this man's new suit and the Red Cross form that said printed in Berlin. But if he had given that information up, then they would change their practice so that their trick worked for the next person who came along. So eventually they made them choose from a pile of discarded clothes that had been from people who died and had been washed and thrown in a big pile. And then they were left in this Antwerp prison, now back together with Derek and the French Canadian Jean-Emile. They listened to all their conversations in the hope that the 3 would reveal any information about routes or people or places they had stayed at. They were fed minimally before they were moved into a prisoner of war camp, Flt Lt 3 in Poland. Now, before I hand over, it's worth mentioning the few key people in this story whose fates were uncertain at the time Ernie and Derek were taken to Flt Lt 3. Could I have the next slide, please? The woman who had betrayed them, Pauline Fleming, they later learned had been shot by the Belgians for treason, as well as her husband, who had also been a collaborator. Now, originally we thought his name was Robert Van Meulen, but from further research, he was actually an infamous, well-known collaborator, René Van Meulen, and one of his aliases was Robert. His business as a hairdresser had been destroyed by RAF bombardments, so he went to the Vlaams Nationale Verbond, the leading force of political collaboration during the German occupation, and he was recruited in an attempt to infiltrate escape lines. When Belgium was liberated in September 1944, Van Meulen fled to Germany and then Austria. He was returned to France by the Germans in 1945, possibly for sabotage assignments, but he managed to get a job in a US Army mess. But by a great twist of fate, one of the American airmen Van Meulen had captured spotted him there and alerted his superiors. Belgian police arrested Van Meulen in Paris. He confessed that he was responsible for the German capture of 177 Allied airmen. The totals may have been much higher. He was tried, found guilty, and executed May the 29th, 1948. Next slide, please. Many resistance fighters have had their work commemorated and highlighted in street names, like Bim van der Klei, a helper of Derek and Ernie, who in this photo is unveiling the street named after him. Leonie van Haasel was arrested and spent 10 months in a concentration camp for her work in helping Allied airmen escape. Could I have the next slide, please? Piet Leermakers, a well-known Vate, was shot at home in a German raid on the 7th of September while trying to escape, along with a person in hiding, Jan van Dongen. They had hoped to escape and hide in a hidden air raid shelter at the back of Piet's farm, but were both killed, leaving 8 fatherless children behind. Derek and Ernie had still been hoping for this unaccounted person to be Mac, and that he would be alive, but Mac had been killed along with 4 others, and it was John Cursitor who had been unaccounted for, since he had been trapped underneath the wreckage of the plane. It was only when the Germans lifted the Lancaster with heavy machinery that they found his body underneath the aircraft, which had left a perfect John-shaped imprint in the ground. As an aside, since the Lancaster blew up, several parts were scattered all over the fields between Vessem and Middelbeers. What you can see here is an original bolt from Lancaster ND 762 that was found some years later and now resides with Ernie's son, David. Could I have the next slide, please, Chris? And as to the fate of Fons van der Heyden, the man who harboured Ernie for just over 2 weeks, it turned out that Ernie was not the first airman that Fons kept safe. Ernie was the 23rd man that Fons had looked after, and many were to follow after him. On September the 20th, 1944, German soldiers detained Fons as he was coming out of church. They had found suspicious belongings in his house, a leftover life jacket, so they searched his house again. At the time, there was an injured American airman who had crashed as part of Operation Market Garden at Arnhem, who was hiding in the attic of the pig shed. He was not discovered, but the Germans had sufficient evidence. The van der Heyden family had helped several American pilots who had crashed on the night of the 17th of September, and the following day they had been brought to the border by members of the local resistance. It was only the injured airman who remained, as he had to be treated. Under severe threats to his family, suspecting that the rescuers had been betrayed, and because he wasn't sure what had been found in his house, van der Heyden admitted to helping 3 American pilots in the previous day. In this way, he hoped to spare his family and the fugitives who were still there. He was taken out into the streets and shot in the back and in the head by German soldiers. He died on the spot. This was only a few days before the liberation of Netterzel. In the days that followed, the family's farmhouse was completely destroyed. Household goods and things of value disappeared. Grenades blew holes in the roof and the attic. The 6 children in the van der Heyden family fled to Middelbeers. His wife, Mina, stayed with her brother. She did not want to leave her husband. Fons rests in the Roman Catholic cemetery in his hometown of Netterzel. It was only later that Ernie discovered that the person who had sheltered him had paid for the help he gave others with his life just before liberation. It's important that we do not forget the extraordinary acts committed by ordinary people and the enormous sacrifices they made for our freedoms. And it's at this point that I hand over to Will to tell you about Ernie's experience in the prisoner of war camp Stalag Luft 3.
Thank you very much, Kitty. Following his time with the German authorities, which Kitty has just been talking about, Ernie was taken to Stalag Luft 3, which was a German Air Force-run prisoner of war camp. the German authorities had a policy where prisoners of war were the responsibility of their respective branches within the German military. So army to army, navy to navy, air force to air force. The camp was situated 100 miles to the southeast of Berlin, an area which was quite ironically chosen because of its soft, sandy ground, which they thought would make tunnelling difficult, and because it would be easily recognisable if it had stained prisoners' uniforms. Can I have the next slide there, please? The camp consisted of huts which were 10 feet by 12 feet, each housing 15 POWs, all in compounds of 15 huts. The camp at its height had grown to cover 60 hectares and housed over 10,000 inmates from all over the world, including US Air Force personnel, RAF and Commonwealth personnel from as far as Australia and South Africa. Can I have the next slide there? Of course, Stalag Luft 3 is most famous for the Great Escape, which was conceived in 1943 and took place on the night of the 24th over to the 25th of March 1944. 600 men were involved in the preparation for the escape in varied roles, ranging from tunnellers to duty pilots. 3 tunnels were dug, nicknamed Tom, Dick and Harry. The secrecy around the escape was such that POWs were threatened with court-martial should they even utter the word tunnel. These tunnels were dug 9 meters below the surface and had a cross-section of roughly 0.6 meters squared, which is incredibly cramped. Next slide, please. Now, one can't help but admire the ingenuity of the people involved in the construction, from the bed frames and furniture which were scavenged to build support, beams for the tunnels, to the tin cans used for everything from lamps to spades to ventilation shafts, and of course the blankets and towels which were used to hide and dispose of excavated soil, which was dumped into communal gardens or spread thinly under the huts. On the fateful night of the escape, 76 people would make it out of the camp through the tunnels. Unfortunately, 73 of which were captured, and Hitler wanted every officer involved in the escape to be shot. However, his advisors convinced him to not be so extreme. He did order more than half to be shot, which was to be carried out by the SS. Of the 3 that did escape, one, Jens Müller, a Norwegian, made it to the UK, landing in Lukers before being sent on to Canada. Of course, Lukers is where we at ESIAS are based, and while there is no relation, it is interesting that there is this small historical connection. Next slide, please. Life in the camp was not easy, with food shortages being the biggest problem, especially towards the end of the war, due to German soldiers being given priority over POWs. However, as was custom, Red Cross packages carrying supplies ranging from food to chocolate to clothes were compiled and rationed out to the prisoners equally. And there is something very admirable about how each POW could put aside their own need for supplies to make sure everybody had enough. And I believe this is most evident in the story that Ernie once told about how the Russian soldiers held in Stalag Luft 3, who were treated very poorly by their German captors, being given the worst jobs in the camp and rarely given supplies, were given spare food rations by the RAF and Commonwealth personnel. Bear in mind that at this time, the Russian soldiers would most likely not have spoken English, and the RAF POWs would most likely not have spoken Russian. However, these men from opposite ends of the planet could still show compassion to each other in such difficult circumstances. Furthermore, prisoner of war camps often developed what would resemble a mini society of sorts. Camps would often have their own currency, known as Lagergeld, which could be used to buy what the German administrators made available to the POWs, which was admittedly scarce at the best of times and non-existent at the worst of times. However, the camps didn't only have their own currency, they also developed over time their own theatres, newspapers such as the Circuit and the Kriegi Times, both pictured on the slide, and radio stations such as KRGY, which is short for Kriegsgefangener, which is German for prisoner of war. Can I have the next slide there? The POWs formed an incredibly tight-knit community within the camp, so close-knit that whenever a new prisoner of war was brought in by the Germans, there was an extensive vetting process they would have to endure before being accepted by the rest of the POWs, which consisted of a new POW being recognised by at least 2 other prisoners. If they were not, they would be intensely interviewed and escorted around the camp for at least 6 months. And the main point of this was to apprehend Germans infiltrating the POWs, with the goal of gathering information about possible escape attempts or to find contraband or other banned substances. Now, we know that Ernie was heavily involved in camp life. We can see from his testaments that he did volunteer for tunnelling. However, as he arrived at the camp after the Great Escape, this meant that the POWs were most likely planning another escape attempt, something that would have been incredibly difficult, considering the camp would have been on high alert and locked down for several months afterwards. Ernie also worked as a duty pilot during his time in the camp. Duty pilots were responsible for logging the movements of camp guards, recording when they start and finish duties and the routes they would take from their accommodation to their posts. And then this was a job the duty pilots did so well throughout the life of the camp that the camp commandant on one occasion used their notes as evidence to bring charges against 2 guards who left duty too early. We also know that Ernie volunteered in other aspects of camp life, such as singing as a bass in the theatre I mentioned earlier. Furthermore, I have no doubt that Ernie would have been involved in the various sporting events that the POWs organised, which included athletics, cricket and even ice hockey in the winter, which the Canadian POWs proved especially capable at. The jobs given to the POWs and the volunteering they did in things such as the theatre, as well as the sports they organised, were of great importance to them, as they were the best way to stave off one of, if not the most pressing issues in the camp, which was boredom. While they did have frequent issues with food, and they had to be constantly aware that they might fall foul of their German guards, the lack of things to do was certainly a pressing issue, and one that the POWs, in my opinion, handled very well. Ernie's time in Stalag Luft 3, while not the longest part of his journey, was, I have no doubt, a defining experience of his life, and I, for one, have thoroughly enjoyed reading about this period of his life. And I would like to hand over to OC Tom McGuinness, who's going to talk about the liberation of Stalag Luft 3 and the long marches.
Thank you, Will. On the 28th of January 1945, exactly 76 years ago today, and the day before Ernie's birthday, the Russian army approached to within 12 miles of Stalag Luft 3, causing Adolf Hitler to order the camp's immediate evacuation. Ernie was woken at 2 in the morning, told to get dressed and grab what items of food he had, and Ernie had made himself a backpack and took a blanket to hang over his shoulders to act as a coat. Upon leaving the compound with around 10,000 other prisoners, Ernie recalls hearing the gunfire of the Russians in the near distance. The POWs were faced with extreme conditions on the march, with sub-zero temperatures well below -5 degrees Celsius, a thick covering of snow and inadequate clothing. They walked through the night and day, eventually being granted shelter in a barn in a village 21 miles from Stalag Luft 3. Ernie himself found a hearse that someone was living in and spent the night on the roof of the hearse with 3 others. Next slide, please. The following day, they walked to Moscow, setting off at 8 a.m. and arriving by the evening. They were granted 3 days of rest here, and the weather started to improve. On the 1st of February, they set off for Spremberg at 10:45, except for 57 POWs who were too sick to continue marching. The guards did not take well to when locals tried to offer the men hot food and drink. They also threatened the POWs that if they were to escape, the Russians would shoot them. Presumably, this was either an empty threat to scare the men into following the guards' orders, or because the Russians wouldn't have had the resources to cater for 10,000 prisoners of war. At 2 a.m. on the 2nd of February, 53 miles from Stalag Luft 3, they reached Spremberg, where, for the first time in just under a week, they had hot food and water. Next slide, please. The respite was short-lived, however, because at 4:30, Ernie was loaded into a cattle cart with around 18 other men on a train bound for Marley and Marley Nord. Conditions were very poor on the train, with no water or toilet facilities. You can only imagine what the men endured for the 2 days they were on the train. After arriving in the evening of the 4th of February, the men walked a further 3 kilometres to the camp, where it took 7 hours for them to be admitted. By now, many were suffering from frostbite, dysentery, and sickness. To make this worse, the new camp had had all its windows broken, wiring removed, and doors missing, leaving the POWs exposed to the elements. Next slide, please. They left on the 10th of April, this time due to the Allies approaching the camp from the west. Ernie walked in a formation that spelt out RAF to try and stop the column from being mistaken for retreating German soldiers. However, there are reports that the column was attacked by the RAF fighters, and from then on, they only travelled at night. During this march, guards and German officers were starting to disappear, presumably deserting due to the inevitable doom of the German army or succumbing to the brutal conditions. Ernie recalls seeing an adjutant aiding a guard with his rifle because he was too weak to carry it. While scavenging for food, Ernie found some eggs and milk. He cooked the eggs and warmed the milk to dip some biscuits into. However, because they'd been living on such poor diets, this meal was far too rich for all the men and made them violently ill. Ernie has had a dislike for eggs ever since. Next slide, please. After walking a further 120 miles in just under 2 weeks, the column neared Lübeck, which they did not enter due to a suspected typhus outbreak. Ernie Holmes spent the rest of his captivity on an estate 7 miles from Lübeck. On the 9th of May, when Ernie was liberated, a British Army truck drove up to him and he recognised the boy from his hometown whom he had played football with. Ernie shouted up to him, "What are you doing here? You should have been here weeks ago." 4 days later, on the 13th of May, Ernie landed back in the UK. Thank you for listening. I'd now like to pass over to Jude, who's going to talk about Ernie's life after the war.
Thank you very much, Tom. After the war, Ernie stayed in the RAF as part of the RAF Transport Command, which was an arm of the Air Force that was responsible for initially transporting aircraft parts from factory to factory. However, after the war, the fleet was used for the transport of goods, parts and personnel to the far reaches of the Empire. Ernie flew regularly to Burma and Singapore during this time. In 1946, Ernie also found time to marry. Irene and Ernie were wed at West Church in Perth and had 2 children, Alison and David, born in 1948 and 52 respectively. In 1948, Stalin imposed a blockade on Western Berlin in order to force the Western Allies out of the city and seal the Iron Curtain. Ernie flew Avro Yorks. As seen on the slide is a lovely rare colour image of a York. As part of the just over 200,000 sorties that supplied West Berlin with everything from meat carcasses, steel pans, and mostly coal for the 14 months, that the air corridors kept the city alive in a feat known as the Berlin Airlift. Next slide, please. Ernie went on to join Glasgow UAS after his time in the Transport Command, where he was a QFI. During his time here, Ernie and a cadet had to bail out of a de Havilland Chipmunk trainer aircraft, the second time that a parachute has saved his life, after the plane could not recover from a planned dive as part of the cadet's training. This happened not far from St Andrews actually, at Errol in Perthshire. After a stint at Glasgow, he joined St Andrews UAS in 1957, a post he served until 1960. His time here saw a visit from an AOC, of which we have a few very interesting black and white images also on the slide, from 1959. Air Vice Marshal J.F. Hobler was treated to a display of aerobatics by the squadron's chipmunks and a ceremonial piping of the haggis at a garden party hosted by the squadron. The squadron also won the Schoon Trophy during his years at the UAS, a tournament still running today. Furthermore, upon his departure, the squadron named a trophy, the Holmes Trophy, after Ernie that is also still running today, the current winner APO Lolly Basu. Next slide, please. Schoon Airdrome awaited next, where Ernie was an instructor for Airworks Training School, training civilian pilots from all over the world, using his skills on Lancasters, Halifaxes and Yorks to help the next generation of pilots fly sleek new jets to the corners of the globe. It was here that in 1965 Ernie was involved in another crash at the aerodrome, this time in a Cessna 310. Whilst training 2 Iraqi pilots, the plane crashed on takeoff and burst into flames. The culprit was a warm fuel valve that starved the engine, causing it to fail just seconds into the flight. Ernie heroically helped his 2 students escape the flames before he himself could get to safety. Ernie suffered severe burns on his hands and face and was in hospital, where he received plastic surgery due to the severity of his injuries. Needless to say, he recovered well. His heroic action did not go unnoticed, however, as a piece of correspondence on the slides from the then Lord Lieutenant of Perthshire, the representative of the Queen in the county, commended him for his bravery and skill and congratulated him. Soon after, Ernie and his wife moved to Nairobi and then Soroti in Uganda to work for East African Airways. During this period, Ernie began having significant sight problems and unfortunately had to give up flying. Returning to Perth, he qualified as a social worker and was based mainly at Perth Prison. Next slide, please. Ernie recently returned to the Netherlands in an emotional visit to set up a new memorial for his 5 crew and friends that lost their lives that night in 1944. The memorial to Lancaster ND 762 can be found in Vessum in Holland and was set up by Ernie and Heemkedunkering de Hoge Dorpen Historical Society. Apologies for my pronunciation of the Dutch there. He also visited the graves of his crew members as the last of the 8 alive. This was thanks to Project Propeller that flew Ernie and the families of the men over to Holland in a ceremony to mark the crash almost 75 years later. Ernie also visited the farm where he was hidden and talked to researchers uncovering the history around the underground movement that he was helped by, as well as the lives of the families involved. A Songs of Praise episode has broadcast Ernie's story very recently. As a deeply religious man whose faith is very important to him and was especially during his capture and internment, he mentioned a very meaningful verse relating to his crew and to those responsible for his escape. I feel that only very few of us can relate to this, but we can all understand. It's from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 13. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jude. Chris, if you can stop sharing, because I'm going to just share my screen.
Yeah, you should be able to now, is it?
And can you see that?
No, not yet.
Okay, 2 secs. Is that up now?
Yeah, we can sit.
Happy, Chris?
Yeah.
Thank you. Jude, thank you. And indeed, thank you, all 6 of you, for your work gathering those amazing tales and stories from 1921 to the present day. It's been brilliant to hear the exploits of Ernie and incredible to hear so much of those tales which have some relevance today. Indeed, I know, but many of you won't, that many of you in the audience today are those pilots, are those trainees, are those family members directly involved in what we've just heard. It reminds me that indeed some of the Nimrod maritime missions which I took part in some ways are very similar. However, also, thank goodness, they're very different in many ways. There are lessons to be learnt. Many of you students, if joining Her Majesty's services, including the Royal Air Force, can take some of the air power examples and lessons we have heard of. You won't realise yet how indeed similar events are, and lessons certainly can be learnt. We learnt of Ernie joining the RAF and flying many types of aircraft, from the Tiger Moth to the Halifax, and then onwards to the mighty Lancaster. Ernie, proudly wearing his Pathfinder wings, departing from RAF Gravely on that fateful night and on another raid, his 30th, to be rescued and helped by the fantastic Vons van der Heyden family and others from the Dutch communities, and how a lifetime family friendship has continued to this day. We learnt about Ernie's adventures and time in Statterluft 3 prisoner of war camp, indeed my favourite, and Ernie's time there just after the Great Escape in March 44 and of the 76 airmen that attempted escape. We then heard the arduous, dreadful, bitterly cold Long March, such a famous World War II event. And as was said earlier, it's incredible that that was 76 years ago this very night. Jumping ahead, we've heard of Ernie's exploits on Glasgow University Air Squadron at Perth in 1954, and then on to St Andrews UAS from 1957 to 1960 on the mighty Chipmunk, initially at Crail and then onwards to Lucas. And amazingly, even I am still not born. And then a final ground tour at RAF Watton in Norfolk with association with the U-2 spy plane, and then retirement, as we've heard, in 1962. Finally, we heard the active remembrance to his crew of 8 and the marking of the 5 brave aircrew who didn't survive that fateful fighter shootdown. I have been nosy in the SUAS archives, which many of you know has seen the final amalgamation in 2003 of Edinburgh, St Andrews, Dundee and Aberdeen universities. Indeed, with changing universities and college statuses, we now have 10 affiliated universities, and the Highlands and Islands was added only 2 years ago. The same increase goes for our sister squadron at Glasgow, adding Strathclyde and Caledonian University to their group. The undergraduates of Scotland are Ret'd catered for. And we can see here of Ernie's in the 540 was mentioned in documents. Ernie was a member of our air squadron in 1957, and he soon went on to a recce at RAF Austin, and those days they had 40 students. This entry shows also his posting as the CFI in 1960. Later in the document, you can see here recorded that Ernie was an A2 above average flying instructor and a Master Green pilot for instrument flying. Ernie, I feel the shared pain, as you must have been tested by those gentlemen of the Central Flying School, CFS, at some time. It indeed sends shivers through me even now. I found the suggestions book for St Andrews University Air Squadron, sadly not the line book, an item now removed from modern crew rooms. I noticed in 1959 a suggestion from one student that Worcester sauce should be provided for the tomato juice, and a request further, Irish coffee should be available. It certainly shows what is important at the time in 1958 and 59. Indeed, in 1968, St Andrews University Air Squadron folded, and this comment shows the reaction. As a member of Her Majesty's Services, I feel the closing of St Andrews University Air Squadron is a decision taken with very little thought, and certainly no foresight. Ladies and gentlemen, the UAS are still under watch for their value for money, so nothing has really changed, even in 2021. And also again, what was important to undergraduates, a little later than Ernie's time, but this entry simply says, more free beer, please. And the bar should not close until 11:45, but should stay open. For all the students on board, nothing has changed some 50 years later. I was delighted to recently discover, although it's been by our front entrance and seen every day, that the Ernie Holmes Trophy, as you heard earlier, but it is still presented annually on SUAS. Since being given by Ernie as the CFI, probably on leaving the squadron, it has been awarded every year, and I was delighted that this year's winner, Acting Pilot Officer Lolly Basu, was also able to make a voice message for Ernie for his birthday, and that has been sent along with others for him to listen to on his birthday. There has been some discussion about the Cup over the last couple of weeks, but here is Ernie presenting the trophy in 1960. Indeed, my secret sources tell me, I'm told now this is maybe never paid for. Never mind, Ernie, no one knows. I'd like to close for my section with showing you all a moving poem written by Ernie as a prisoner of war in Flt Lt in remembrance to his crew on November Delta 762 and ensuring they all will be remembered. The SUAS team and I would like to share it with you as a team. When the sun sets and darkness falls, I will remember. When the sun rises and another day is born, I will remember. For remembrance is all that I possess, of these I know so well, those who flew with me into the silent night to fight the foe.
They asked not for bloodshed, nor did they start this fight, but when they heard the bugle call, they jumped to fight for right.
Often they prepared for missions, flying into the sleepy night, to bring death and destruction to those who called right might.
They did their job right. They did it well, but this couldn't last. For on the 23rd of May we fell and became as the past.
4 of the 8 are missing. These we know are dead. 3 more are accounted for, but the 8th man is still ahead, making his way for his homeland. Keep going, my friend.
Tommy, Johnny, Mac, and Jock have left this earth, but we who live will remember. I with Derek and Ron.
From the setting of the sun till the rising of the same, we will think of those who kept up England's fame. Will you in England remember?
Thank you very much. Finally, to you, Ernie, it has been fascinating to read and hear your story and share it all with you tonight. We hope to publish our story collection in tandem with literally hundreds of documents and photos on the internet, on various sites, and maybe in the future we'll publish these on our Squadron alumni pages and through Air Officer Scotland, the Scottish Aviation and STEM Trail. I will work with the 35 Squadron Association and any others wanting to save and record these events, but only with full family permission. Finally, Ernie, although I'm delighted you're here with us, from us all we wish you a safe and enjoyable 100th birthday, and we toast your exploits to date. Just before I hand over to the family of Dr. David Holmes and potentially his sister, Mrs. Alison Marshner, I would just like to say, obviously things have changed slightly, and for all of you, things by the squadron were planned for tomorrow. Not only from Lossiemouth, a typhoon from fly past, but also ourselves out east of Scotland and Glasgow were looking forward to a fly past. But sadly, under these dreadful times of COVID, this has not been permitted. We will share on social media, and I know other activities are planned on the media, the Telegraph and the RAF News, etc. And also Ernie will have received countless messages and cards from the Chief of Air Staff, as you heard earlier, to Air Officer Scotland, and all the way down to even Acting Pilot Officer Lolly Basu. The squadron is going to show you later, hopefully, a Facebook entry that we're going to publish tomorrow morning, and it is so impressed. I'd like to try and share that with you later. And you can follow us on SUAS on the Facebook pages and see those. And I will, after David and Alison, will open the floor for questions. But I'm also conscious that many of you have been touched and indeed were directly involved in Ernie's life to date. So maybe there are some short tales to tell as well. So, Dr. David Holmes, can I pass you across? Can I pass you the microphone?
You may indeed.
Invite you if you wish to say a few words to us.
I am gobsmacked, and I only ever thought he was Dad. the students and Paul have put together an incredibly detailed account of someone who for us is a very special man, but after tonight he has become a living part of our history. And I think it's only right that we learn from what's happened to Dad and his life and take those lessons forward. There are so many people tonight from Dad's past, and in particular, there is a contingent from Holland, the Van der Heyden family, who are listening in. Welcome to all of those. I hope that you feel that the students have done justice to your incredible part of his life. I'm about to have a little cry, so I'm going to stop now and hand over to my big sister. But before I go, Dad, you said to me that when you were locked down in Kincarethy, the prisoner of war camp was much worse than this. Well, I believe you now. Thanks, Dad, for everything. Alison?
Yeah, I would reinforce what David has said and thank all you students. I'm so grateful for all the effort you put into this. I can see that you didn't stop working until the last minute because there are things that have been added from since we had the run through on Monday. Yeah, my father is a very special person, and I'm so glad that the Dutch family are here, as well as the daughter and the husband of the student who helped him when he was shot down. And I'm also so glad that my husband's German family have also been attending. What more can I say? Thank you. Thank you.
David, Alison, thank you very much. Your words are very special, and actually the pleasure, and I know from the six of us who've studied it, it's been all ours, and wonderful. And I hope, Ernie, I hope you haven't learnt anything. Ernie, if you're speaking, Ernie, I'm sadly just on mute. Maybe Kieran would help you.
Kieran? Kieran?
Callum, can you unmute Ernie? Do you have that facility?
Unfortunately not. I'll do my very best, but I don't think I can.
You can just mute.
Yeah, not useful. Sorry.
Okay, well, Ernie can join us at any time. It's kind of free time now for a period of time. To the 250 of you, the floor is open, either for adding to the story or those that have been touched or particularly involved, or indeed, I have some experts here, not us, but other family experts who can answer any questions, if any. So if you'd like to ask a question, please unlock your camera and turn your mic on. Thank you. If there's no particular questions.
I'll add to the story if I'm allowed. Hello everyone, my name's Laura. I'm Grandpa's granddaughter, hence why I'm calling him Grandpa. Grandpa and
I think I now need sleep.
It'll be a quick one, Grandpa, don't
Thank
worry.
you for all that you have done with me. Thank you for bringing me back to life. And bringing my past so that it would never be forgotten what happened. And I'd be proud to say I'll be a member of their squadron yet, for a long time yet. I thank them for listening. And I say, God bless to all. Good night, and God bless.
Ernie. It is. Thank you for coming back to us, Ernie.
That is Richard speaking. Good night, all.
Good night, Ernie.
Good night, Dad.
Good night.
Good night, Grandpa.
Thanks.
Good night, Grandpa.
Good
night,
Ernie.
Good
Enough for
night.
what you've done. You've got the records. You've kept everything going. Thank you for all you've done. Les also. She's been the workhorse of the Holmes family. I say good night and God bless. I need to go and excuse me.
I think maybe the party's starting in the home. I think they've got the downstairs party starting maybe.
I'll see you later.
Paul, would you like me to just come in and sum up for a little bit then?
You can do. I was just going to invite I think it was granddaughter. Hard to know if it's granddaughter or great granddaughter. Laura was going to. Oh, there you are. We see.
There you are.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't, and luckily Grandpa chipped in as always and shut me up. It's pretty standard. I just wanted to add just a little story really. I've got many about our grandpa, but this one particularly pertains to his time in the RAF. I was very lucky to accompany Grandpa to visit the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight a few years ago, only 6 years ago, and we made a flight suit up with a badge. Grandpa, which when he was handed it, he handed me his white stick and donned his flight suit, and we left where there was a Lancaster sitting on the forecourt with engines blazing, and Grandpa knew exactly what was in front of him. The hangar and turned off its engines, and again he handed me his white stick. He felt his way up the fuselage to the door. He touched the plaque, which I believe is on every single Lancaster, commemorating those who flew them, as a mark of respect. And it was like watching his 21-year-old former pilot self get back into a Lancaster. He went up the steps and up the body of the aircraft and over the bulkhead with a spirit and jumped into the cockpit and started doing pre-flight checks as though he had been doing it yesterday. At that stage, he asked me to leave the aircraft, and I thought, well, it's a bit rude, but okay, I'll go down and take some photographs. So I went down to the hangar, wandered around a bit, and about 40 minutes later, after listening to peals of laughter, with Grandpa sitting with the current pilot of the Lancaster, and I went back in and sort of asked to rejoin the party. And the conversation went on to other topics, and then we went into lunch, and I turned to the pilot and said to the chappie, "Well, what was all that about?" And Grandpa overheard me, and he turned to me and said, "There are some stories, Laura, that a granddaughter simply cannot hear." And the whole table burst into peals of laughter, and to this day, I'm not quite sure what they were. I fear to only imagine what stories he was regaling when he was in that cockpit. But honestly, it was like watching 21-year-old Flight Lieutenant Holmes back in the cockpit again, and it was wonderful.
Laura, thank you for that. You're quite right. We never forget, although it's getting a bit rusty at times lately, but a wonderful story. And I'm glad you managed to visit the Battle of Britain flight down at Coningsby. Ladies and gentlemen, a little late, but nice to see him on. If I can introduce the Officer Commanding of East of Scotland, Glasgow Air Squadron and Glasgow Air Squadron, Squadron Leader Carl Meelan, just to sort of summarise where we are to date.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Brilliant. Despite COVID, despite the vagaries of technology, I'm absolutely delighted and indeed privileged to be here tonight to be able to take part in the celebrations for Ernie's birthday tomorrow, 100 years old. Do you know what? I need to obviously thank Paul and the team that have put this together, but it's not just the squadron, from Air Officer Scotland to not less than 2 Lord Lieutenants for being here, to Monty for first raising this and bringing us together and pointing us in directions that we've all come up with ways to work, to have an international audience here for this evening. What a night. I know Ernie has just nipped off, but I'm absolutely inspired. I sit here and I've heard some of the story before as the team have been practicing, but what does it say to me? It says to me that in this day and age, where as a species of human beings that are threatened by a global pandemic, and we're all having a tough time, and we're sitting at home and we're feeling that we're trapped, I look at this story and say, what resilience people can have and how we can move forward. And do you know what? Spending the last few months either sat at home or not being able to meet friends, it is nothing like being sat in a prisoner of war camp or being involved in a world war. So I look to this story personally to say, what a great inspiration. We can move forward from this. It sort of falls to me to thank the team for putting it together. I think they've done a fantastic job. I'm sure you'll agree with me there. It is great to see so many of you online tonight. I'm currently the boss of the University of Glasgow Air Squadron and also the East of Scotland Air Squadron, both of which are derivatives of squadrons that Ernie has served on. I too have served on operations overseas. I'm still not convinced which was more trialing, flying with the students or flying in combat zones, who knows. But I've certainly not had to endure anything like Ernie has. What a great night. I'm going to sign off there because I want to give other people a chance to talk. Again, thank you to Paul and the team. Thank you to all the students on the squadron for coming together for this. Thank you to all the friends and family for coming along tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly am going to raise a wee dram and say happy birthday for tomorrow for Ernie. As I said, I'm currently boss of both squadrons. I'd like to hand over to Squadron Leader Campbell Blake, who you heard from earlier. He's taking over from me in the next few weeks. Campbell, over to you.
Thanks, Carlos. I just reiterate what Carlos has said. I want to thank all the team for what's been a great night, in particular Paul Cunningham, who's put in an incredible amount of effort to bring tonight together and to make it so poetic, dovetailing all the elements of Ernie's fantastic life story together. We at ESUAS would have loved to have done more to celebrate tomorrow, as already been mentioned, visiting him in Perth, potentially fly past, and unfortunately COVID has put paid to these ideas. However, the reason I'm speaking now and what I'm very, very pleased to announce is that in honour of Ernie, we have renamed the building at Lookers that ESUAS uses as the Holmes Building. and that will serve as a monument to him and his story throughout history, and will remain the name of the building no matter what happens to it. I really hope that Ernie is going to be able to come and visit us soon, once COVID allows, to be in his building. And I would like to wish him personally a very happy birthday, which I hope people can pass on to him. Paul, do you want to sum up?
PC, you're on mute.
I think Paul's going to put up some pictures of the building that now is going to hold Ernie's name. Right, the last slide.
That's just what I said. Amazing. Oh, I'm clicking away. There's too many open, and I forgot to share. Oh, I need to share screen. You're quite right. There we go. And it's jumped ahead.
It's like Met Brief all over again, Paul.
It is. Why does it do that? There we go, ladies and gentlemen.
Slightly better, Carlos, than most Met Briefs. It's slightly better.
The one and only Building 368, as of midnight tonight, the Holmes building. A picture of the front door, which will be decorated with Ernie's name, the rear of the squadron, and just to show you all what we fly, the mighty Tutor aircraft to deliver elementary flying training to the Royal Air Force, and just our hangar.
Yeah, we can't see the pictures, Paul.
I think most people can.
There's no pictures at all on my. Oh, that's better.
Okay, I don't know why it did say. Shall I just try? I'll just try. It's not going to work, I don't think. I don't know why. I'll come back to that. It's a building. It's fantastic. It's beautiful. It's got aircraft in. It's got a tutor. So that's good. Right. The last thing tonight is just to, perhaps I'd like to just try an experiment. I am so pleased that a different part of the squadron, the media team, we have taken some prose of Ernie's story, about 1 minute, and a student has written some music to accompany that. And indeed, 3 students then read it out with images, some of which you've seen this evening. And that'll all be on Facebook tomorrow as our sort of birthday message to Ernie from the squadron. So I'm going to ask Jez to just share his slide and try and play it. We're not quite sure whether it'll work over Teams. If not, follow us on Facebook tomorrow.
Are you seeing that one then, PC?
Yes, you can do it. You're clever.
Maybe you can tell me if you can hear it as well. Be handy.
Should it be now? Should it?
So you're not getting any sound through there?
No, we're just getting the pictures.
Okay, that's no problem. What I'll do then is I will share the YouTube link, and then our guests can watch in their own time, perhaps.
Okay.
If this isn't going to work over Teams. But this will all be up on Facebook tomorrow morning and zero on Instagram.
It is. We did think this, but it is so impressed, and I'm so grateful to the team that. So if you can stop sharing, Jez. Okay, ladies, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us this evening. As everyone has said, it's actually been our pleasure. It's fantastic to see. I've heard lots of names, and from the youngest one I can see now on my screen, rocking away, I think Dr. James's daughter. So I can see that, and it's fantastic to see some faces. We're going to leave. The Teams event is now available to you all to chat, say hello to each other until 4 p.m. tomorrow. It's a 24-hour window. I doubt many of you are on, but we're just going to leave it on live and open for people to talk freely, and if you wish, and we'll close it down later. But from us all in Eshuas, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, 6 students. You've been amazing. And that's us. A very good evening. We're here to chat, have a glass of wine, and maybe a tot of birthday cake and whiskey.
Paul and all the students, well done. You are absolutely superb. Thank you.